So finally I got around to make this video about these two amps behind me, which I have been requested to do for a long time. And you know, for a long time I used to use only the combo version of the Silver Jubilee from actually the late 80s, so it's over 30 years old, and it is in this black and gold edition. And I used this amp, the 2554, for many years until 2019, when Marshall had this complete series of the classic amps, but in a smaller form factor. So that is a version of the classic JCM 800, or the Studio Classic like it's called in the reissue, and a version of the Silver Jubilee and a version of the Plexi called the Studio Vintage. However, the Silver Jubilee had been around for a couple of years beforehand, but you know, in 2019 they had this complete series, and when I saw that setup, you know, I immediately wanted both the Plexi and Silver Jubilee with matching cab. You know, being a Frusciante fan, I just felt like that would be an ideal Frusciante home amp setup. And you know, I started by getting the Plexi and using the combo next to it, but first of all, I didn't feel like it looked as clean as it would look with the Silver Jubilee in the same form factor with the small head and matching cab. And also the sound wouldn't be as balanced, because you know, with these cabs I have two cones and one is angled, so it's nice to have the same setup so you can balance the amps better. And also the reissue is more stable compared to my over 30-year-old combo amp. So because of those reasons, even though I already had a Silver Jubilee in the combo version, I decided to get Silver Jubilee in this form factor. And then the question becomes, you know, I have used these two amps for 2.5 years and I have never really addressed them exclusively in a video. And what is the reason for that? Well, you know, first of all, I felt like it would be an important video to make. You know, the amps are a quite fundamental part of your guitar setup. And the next reason, which kind of ties into this being an important video, is that, you know, I had some problems with the setup that I couldn't really explain. You know, I feel like I don't really use this setup exactly like John does, and I had a hard time knowing how to explain that, because I just use, you know, trial and error to get a sound that I like. And you know, that kind of makes it hard to talk about it in a video. And you know, my experience with these two amps is that, you know, the Silver Jubilee works quite well. I feel like I can use similar settings to what I believe John used, and it works as I expect it to work, and I get the sound that I expect and really like. But when it comes to the Plexi, when I try to use similar settings to what I believe John used, I just really don't like the sound at all. And the difference between how I use it and how I believe John used it is that I think that John blended in the high treble channel and the normal channel together, but when I try that, I get a really harsh tone that, yeah, I don't think it's pleasant at all. And I should clarify that that is in a Frusciante based setup, where I get the crunch from the chorus ensemble. But when I use the Plexi on its own, I think it sounds really good when I blend in the normal channel and the high treble channel. But you know, in this video here today, we focus on using this setup for a Frusciante style sound. So to solve this, when I use the Plexi in a Frusciante style setup, I actually only use the normal channel. And to illustrate what I mean, I will do a demo where I compare using the normal channel only, and where you blend in the high treble channel with the normal channel like I believe John did. And in the first comparison, I will only use the Plexi, and I will use it with the bridge pickup. And in the second comparison, I will use both amps in stereo, and then I will use the neck pickup. And I should add that I will add pictures of the Plexi so you really understand how it is set up. And also I will show how the level control knob on the chorus ensemble is set up, because I actually alter that when I switch settings on the Plexi, because I felt like when I only used the normal channel, I wanted an extra push to get that nice crunchy sound. So yeah, let's take a listen to the demo. Alright, so maybe you don't agree, but yeah, to me I just think I get a really unpleasant and harsh sound when I blend in the high treble channel. And also another thing you can notice is that when I use both amps in stereo, you know, the Plexi seems to get distorted too easily and the Silver Jubilee becomes too clean in comparison, so you get a really unbalanced sound, which is not really nice at all. And that is also a problem for me when I blend in the high treble channel, that it gets harder to balance the amps because the Plexi simply distorts too easily, which I guess is the opposite to Frusciante setup, or at least I believe the major is responsible for his clean sound. And now you might wonder, why am I making this video here today when I can't really explain you know, what's going on, the technical differences and all that. But the reason is that Will Galuccio from Jungle Lab very kindly over a Skype call elaborated on the technical differences between my home amp setup here and John Frusciante's amp setup, and I really learned a lot from that, and that is what I will go through now. So if we start with the Silver Jubilee, I feel like what Will explained really matches my experience with the amp, and that is that, you know, the main difference inside the amp is that in the vintage one you have vintage components and in the reissue one you have newer components, but the difference in sound isn't that large, and you know, you can easily tweak the sound anyway with the EQ. And according to him, the largest difference in my setup is actually, you know, the speakers, where I use the Celestion Vintage 30 while John used the Celestion G12T75. So Will's conclusion on the Silver Jubilee reissue is that with the reissue you get a cheaper and more reliable amp compared to the vintage one. But when we get to this amp, the Studio Vintage, which I from now on will call the Plexi, and compare it to the Marshall Major that John used, we have a lot of difference that I believe explain, you know, my experience with this amp. And the first difference is the EQ, and to put it simple, what I learned from Will is that the Marshall Major tend to preserve the original tone of the instrument, while the Plexi tends to color it. And the next difference is the treble bleed capacitor, which is something that my Plexi has, which perhaps can explain the harsh trebly tone that I get when I blend in the high treble channel. And the Major, some of them had this treble bleed capacitor and some did not have it. And as you might know, Will is working on his version of the Marshall Major, where he has tried both with and without this treble bleed capacitor, and his recommendation is to not have this treble bleed capacitor. And the next difference, which I thought was a large factor, was the wattage of the amps. You know, these two amps in high mode they are 20 watt amps, and in low mode they are 5 watt amps. But you know, in Frusciante setup, the Silver Jubilee was 100 watts and the Major was 200 watts. So I thought that was the reason for the large headroom and the clean tones of the Major. But it turns out that, you know, if you double the wattage, you only get a 3 decibel increase, so that isn't really a large factor. So I guess we can remove that difference and instead replace it with this next difference which I learned, and that is the output transformer, which converts the audio from the power tubes to the speakers. So the Plexi has the standard transformer while the Major has the ultra linear transformer, and the difference here is that the Tandy tends to go gradually from clean to distorted, while with the Major you tend to be either clean or distorted. And I guess that explains my experience with, you know, the Plexi starting to distort too quickly, making it hard for me to balance the two amps when I blend in the high treble channel. And that relates to the volume jump aspect of the Major. So even if you dime the Major, you know, putting everything on 10, you will still get a volume jump if you kick in the DS2. At least that is why I learned from Will. But when it comes to the Plexi, you won't get that same volume jump. And that has been my experience, you know, working with the Plexi. And you know, all of this assumes that you have a pushed signal from, for example, the chorus ensemble. And I feel like this difference in volume jump is actually in my favor, because, you know, in this small space it's really nice to not get any volume jumps. But you know, if you play large arenas and stadiums, I guess it's nice to get an extra push for your solos. And the final important difference is the power tubes, where the Major uses the KT88 while the Plexi uses the EL34. So if we put it really short, the ratio of the Silver Jubilee is quite similar to John's Silver Jubilee, But the issue with this Plexi here is a bit different from John's Marshall Major. Alright, so let's wrap up this video by answering, the topic of this video. Is this what I have behind me here an optimal Frusciante home amp setup or not? And due to the Plexi and the difference you have there compared to John's Marshall Major, I guess you can't really say it is the best alternative if you want to get everything right. But I would also say that, for my context and my purposes and how I use the amps, I feel like it is quite optimal due to several reasons. And the first reason for me is the form factor. So, I really like this smaller design. It doesn't take up as much space, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but I actually like, the design, how it looks with the smaller design compared to the larger one, because with the larger one there's so much empty space that it just looks oversized to me. But I guess I should add that, if I had this amp setup in a large stadium or something like that, I guess it would look quite ridiculous. But at the same time, I guess it would look really ridiculous if I had this Marshall full stack, with 100 watt or even 200 watt amps behind me in this small space. So I guess it's context based on what looks the best. But the smaller form factor also, gives a cheaper price, and the smaller form factor definitely isn't a problem when it comes to volume. I have never actually used these amps really without attenuators. And the next reason is what I talked about before, the fact that I don't get any volume jumps with the Plexi here, which actually makes it a bit more optimal in a home environment. And finally, I can't really copy John's settings and get a similar tone, but at the same time I'm free to dial in the settings I want, and I feel like if you experiment with different settings, you can still get a very Frusciante-like tone with this Plexi amp anyway, so I don't really feel that that is a large problem for me. Alright, so that is the video, and now I'm really curious about your comments on this video, because I feel like there are a lot of things to discuss, like for example when I did that sound comparison there between my settings and when I blend in the high treble channel. What do you think about that sound difference there, and everything I learned from Will, and like I talked about with the technical differences, do you have input to that? And also I think that a lot of you have a very different setup from mine when it comes to the amps, but still get a really nice tone. So that can also be really interesting to hear about, both for me and for others, because I think there are many ways to get a good Frusciante tone. I definitely do not think that you need this exact setup, even though like I concluded it works good for me. And yeah, also please leave a like on this video for the algorithm, and I'll see you in the next video.